Hi everybody, this is Dr. Jenkins. So we're going to finish the endocrine system here. So I want to pick up where we left off and just finish our discussion of how hormones are transported and then how they interact with our target tissue. After we do this, we're just going to go hormone by hormone, okay? And I'm going to let you know only what you need to know. So let's review. Remember, we had three different types of hormones. We had the peptide hormones, the monoamine, which are amino acid derivative, and the lipid or sex hormones. So I would start there. And then, in terms of how they are transported in the blood, in terms of how they interact with the target tissue, has everything to do with whether they are water soluble or lipid or fat soluble. So remember, the water-soluble hormones are all the peptide hormones and the monoamine except for thyroid. So really, what that's telling us is it's epinephrine and norepinephrine. So all the peptide hormones and epinorepinephrine are water-soluble. And what that means is they can be transported in the blood as is. The blood is mostly water. These are water-soluble. Therefore, they dissolve in the blood, travel freely in the blood. On the other hand, we have the lipid-soluble hormones, and those would be our sex hormones. Here it's called steroid hormones, but we can also use the word sex hormones, which maybe can help us more, testosterone, estrogen, and then thyroid. These are lipid-soluble, the sex hormones and thyroid hormones, so they cannot dissolve in the blood. They're not water soluble. So for them to be transported in the blood, lipid soluble, they need a little transport protein or transport vesicle. And that's what this is showing you. The blue triangle is the hormone, and then this green little thing is the transport protein. Now, when they get to a target cell, target tissue, every hormone must bind to a matching receptor. Sometimes that receptor is going to be in the plasma membrane. Sometimes the receptor is going to be inside the cell in the nucleus. We'll talk about that in a moment. But no matter what, every hormone must bind to a specific receptor. How does it happen? Let's start with lipid soluble. We discussed this in lecture in person, but I wanted to do a nice little review here. Just took a sip of water, pardon me. So lipid soluble hormones, they need a transporter in the blood. However, once they get to a target tissue, because the cell membrane is made up of lipids, remember, the cell membrane is made up of a phospholipid bilayer, lipids. Because the cell membrane is made up of lipids, the lipid-soluble hormone can travel from the blood right into the target cell. One-step process. Lipid-soluble goes right through into the cell, and it binds to a receptor in the nucleus. Now, for a water-soluble hormone, what color can I use for water-soluble? Let's use water-soluble cannot move directly into the cell because it's not fat-soluble. So it is a two-step process. We're being very general. So the water-soluble hormone leaves the bloodstream and it binds to a receptor, a matching receptor, in the target cell membrane. That's step one. First messenger is what it's called. But then that activates a series of chemical reactions inside the cell. That's the second messenger. So we have the first messenger, which is when the water-soluble hormone binds to the receptor in the cell membrane. And then the second messenger is when that first binding puts into action a series of chemical reactions that will ultimately cause the message from the hormone to bind to a receptor inside the nucleus. Now, there's some extra stuff I want to point out, but you don't need to know. This is extra. There are some things called G proteins If we look more closely at this, right? You don't have to know this, folks. I could, if I wanted to, I could have you memorize every single step of this. But you don't have to. But what am I pointing out? That there's a first messenger. The hormone binds to a receptor in the cell membrane. That was the first messenger, which triggers a series of chemical reactions inside the cell. Second messenger. Notice a lot of these you'll see like cyclic AMP, G protein. Anytime you, this is not going to be on the test, but anytime you see those words, G protein, cyclic AMP, this is what we're talking. We're talking about a hormone binding to a receptor. And I only bring it up because a lot of our prescription drugs target these hormone receptors. If we know a hormone receptor does a certain thing, then we can manipulate that. We can deliver a pill or some sort of medication that can either make that hormone receptor action more or it can inhibit it. So I'm not going to worry about the G proteins, but I just wanted to point it out. A lot of our medications have their action at this hormone receptor interaction. Okay, this is the last piece of business before we start going through the hormones themselves. What about the effect of the hormone? It's not, okay, let me go back for a moment. Remember we started this whole conversation and I said, really, hormones are chemical messengers. Hormones are chemical messengers. What does growth hormone say to a muscle? Grow. What does erythropoietin say to the red bone marrow? Produce red blood cells. What does insulin say to the liver? Uptake glucose and store it as glycogen. What does testosterone say to the testes? Produce sperm. What does testosterone say to the muscle? Testosterone says to the muscle, build more muscle. So each hormone is a chemical messenger. But I want to talk about that message. It's not like it's a detailed phone message. You know, imagine your muscle being a voicemail. Beep. Hi, you've reached the biceps brachii muscle. Please leave a message. And the hormone says, hi, this is growth hormone. I'd like you to grow about 15 actin every second for the next 20.2 minutes. No, I know it's really stupid. But I'm getting a point across. It's not a detailed chemical message. What happens is, and I have a picture of a red light, green light here on purpose. Excuse me. When a hormone binds to a receptor, when that hormone binds to the receptor, it has basically one of two things it will do. That binding of the hormone to the receptor will activate that cell to do more of what it's already doing, or it will inhibit that target cell, and the target cell will do less. So the cell, a muscle cell, is always going to contract. A white blood cell is always going to try and kill bacteria. So each cell has its that's not going to change its function. But what a hormone does is it either says, go do more of your function, green light. If the effect of a hormone, if the message is to activate, it tells the muscle, do more muscle building, green light. You have the green light to go. Other hormones deliver a message that will inhibit the target cell, and that's like getting the red light. Think about cortisol. Cortisol is an anti-inflammatory. So what is the ultimate message, quote unquote, of cortisol? It's an anti-inflammatory. So it wants to inhibit the inflammatory response. It tells the immune system, red light, slow down. There's, of course, more going on behind the scenes, but in essence, this is really how it works. A hormone gets to a receptor, and it either says, do more of what you're doing, green light, go, 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 or it delivers a message that inhibits. All right, don't worry about that. I give you an example. So remember I mentioned the G protein? An example of this is all the GLP-1 medications like Ozempic that are going on right now. I said that a lot of our medications have their effects at G proteins. Well, here's one of those examples. You don't need to know that, but it's there if you want. This medication is affecting the second messenger at the receptor. All right, here we go. So now we're going to move quickly. We're going to go gland by gland and say, what's the gland? What hormones does it produce? And what do those hormones do? I want to remind you, you have access to a beautiful table. You are not going to have to know all of these, but this is a really great review for you to have. You might just want to circle what I'm asking you to know. Also, I've updated this PowerPoint. Everything you need to know is in red. This allows me to move a little quicker. This is the part that's very straightforward. Here is the hormone, here's what it does. So it's a lot more memorization. We're going to start at the top of the body, superior in the brain, hypothalamus, and we're going to work our way down. Here we go. The hypothalamus, it is in the brain. What does it do? The hypothalamus oversees the pituitary gland. This is the hypothalamus up here. We've zoomed in right here in the middle of the brain. Can you see that? We've zoomed in right here in the middle of the brain. If we zoom in, the hypothalamus is this mass of nuclei here. Dangling down from it would be the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus oversees the pituitary gland. Very important job. This is why we said that in the absence of one master control center, what oversees the most of the endocrine system? The hypothalamus. Precisely because it oversees the pituitary gland. Second, the hypothalamus produces ADH. We know all about ADH, antidiuretic hormone, water retaining. And it also produces a hormone called oxytocin. This is going to be a hormone important for women during childbirth, and it's also going to be a hormone that signals the breast tissue to produce milk in women after the baby's been born. But look, these hormones travel to the posterior pituitary where they're released from. So ADH and oxytocin are produced in the hypothalamus, but not released from the hypothalamus. ADH and oxytocin are produced in the hypothalamus, but then they travel down to the posterior pituitary gland, and that's where they're released from. It's even showing you that. Where is oxytocin and ADH released from? The posterior pituitary gland. Let's see, do I have the functions? We're going to see the functions later, but over hypothalamus, of those two hormones. Overall, hypothalamus oversees the pituitary gland, produces two hormones, ADH, oxytocin. There is a portal system. You don't have to know the specifics, but we talked about this earlier. We had a portal system in the liver. I just want to remind you, what is a portal system? A network of two capillary beds. We only have a two capillary bed network in and around the liver, hepatic portal system, and between the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. So we have one capillary bed there and a second capillary bed there. You just need to know it exists between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. By the way, another word for pituitary is hypophyseal. So that's why it's called hypothalamo-hypophyseal. Hypophyseal is another word for pituitary. Let's talk about those pituitary glands. The anterior, otherwise known as the adenohypophysis. I've put in red the hormones that you need to know. These are the hormones that I'm asking you that are produced and released from the anterior pituitary gland, which dangles down from the hypothalamus in the brain. Thyroid stimulating, follicle stimulating, luteinizing, and growth hormones. So we're in the anterior pituitary. It releases follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. This, and I rather like these pictures, that's why I have them on here. It's so crazy, folks. We're still in the brain, this tiny little gland in the brain. The anterior pituitary gland is going to send a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone down to the primary sex organs. In males, the primary sex organ is the testes. In females, the primary sex organ is the ovary. It stimulates these primary sex organs to produce the sex cells. So it stimulates development of the eggs and sperm. It stimulates the follicles of the testes and the ovary to produce the egg and sperm. Isn't this crazy? So before the testes and the ovary can even begin to produce and do their thing, they've got to receive a hormonal message from the anterior pituitary gland. Luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone also travels from the anterior pituitary. I'm going to talk about it more in the females. Luteinizing hormone in the females is what stimulates ovulation. We'll talk about that more next chapter. Ovulation is midway through the month is when the egg is released. You can imagine, folks, on our final exam, matching. On one side, list of hormones. On the other, what those hormones do. Thyroid stimulating hormone. Be careful because there is follicle stimulating with an F, follicle stimulating, and now we're doing thyroid stimulating. Well, it does what it says it does. The thyroid stimulating hormone leaves the anterior pituitary gland and it goes to the thyroid. And it stimulates the thyroid to produce its own hormones. So another chain reaction. The thyroid is not going to produce its hormone until it gets a message from the thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary gland first. And then, of course, of interest to you, I'm sure, is growth hormone secreted from the anterior pituitary gland, and this goes everywhere. Primarily, we think about growth hormone going to muscles and bones, so it stimulates growth, promotes growth in muscles and bones. As a side note, you don't need to know IGF, but it is a pretty important anabolic hormone, insulin-like growth factor. That one, when growth hormone goes to the liver, it tells the liver to produce IGF, insulin-like growth factor, and that also is going to stimulate growth in muscles and bones. We like that. We got a double whammy of growth in the muscles and the bones. Okay. There's some extra information about growth hormone that you don't have to know. The levels do fluctuate. It is a diurnal hormone, which means it's highest when you're sleeping and in the morning, and it will lessen throughout the day. Let's go back to that posterior pituitary gland. It's going to receive the hormones from the hypothalamus, ADH and oxytocin, but this is where those two hormones are released. Let's just get to the functions. We already know ADH is our water retaining hormone. ADH goes to our kidneys and tells our kidneys to retain more water. The new one for you is probably oxytocin. This is a hormone that stimulates the uterus to contract during childbirth. Look at the far-reaching effects of the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. You don't have to know this chart. You just have to be able to match up a hormone and the function. But I just want to show you. It's so important it has its own name. The HPA axis. Hypophyseal pituitary adrenal axis. You think I just want to sound smart when I'm saying that. Let me tell you. I'm taking this course right now on exercise physiology in females. When I got my PhD in exercise physiology, all throughout my career, we always talk about the HPA axis. It is so important in our response to exercise. So I know this is kind of like blah, blah, blah. But remember one hormone I talked about? Growth hormone. What could be more important for an athlete than growth hormone? What could be more important for an athlete than having our thyroid gland be stimulated so we can have a high metabolic rate and produce energy for our muscles? What could be more important for an athlete than being able to retain water so I don't become dehydrated? So there's just so much that's dictated by the hypothalamus up here and the pituitary glands. Their hormones pretty much go everywhere in the body. You don't have to know this. For my nursing students, I do have them know this, but you don't. If you're interested, the posterior pituitary gland is controlled via nerves from the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus through hormones and blood. Doesn't want to write there. You don't have to know that. Just extra in case. And here are some examples of pituitary disorders that you don't need to know. All right, we're going to bang these out. You ready? We started superiorly with the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and now we're moving on down. Pineal gland. This is also in the brain. It's right back here. Pineal secretes melatonin, which helps with our sleep-wake cycle. Some people give their kids or even take melatonin at night to try and help them sleep. We have it naturally. Keep on moving down. Thyroid. Please be careful. The thyroid is the one around the neck. In a moment, we're going to be discussing the thymus. The thymus is lower, right above the heart. But right now, the thyroid surrounds the trachea. It's our largest endocrine gland. The two hormones that we're going to talk about are thyroxine and calcitonin. Here we go. Thyroxine. Its basic function is to increase metabolic rate. If someone has hypothyroidism, what does hypo mean? More or less? Hypo means less. So hypothyroidism means that the thyroid is not producing enough hormones. If we don't have as much of this hormone, our metabolic rate goes down. These people will feel tired a lot of the time. They will be prone to gaining weight because their metabolic rate is slowed down. Let's talk about calcitonin. Let me just go ahead for one moment and make sure I have this right, because sometimes I forget. Calcitonin is released when calcium's too high. Okay, that's what I thought. Just want to make sure. Calcitonin is released when blood calcium is high. So you've probably heard of the thyroid hormones and metabolic rate. That one's a little easier. But maybe what you didn't know is that the thyroid gland also secretes a hormone that helps to regulate blood calcium. Here's what you need to know. Calcitonin, it's in the name, calcium, calcitonin. This particular hormone is released when blood calcium is high. To fix that, it stimulates osteoblasts. Remember, B for building. These are the key words. Calcitonin is released when blood calcium is high, stimulates building. I'm going to go ahead for a moment because a little bit later is a lovely blood calcium regulation slide. You know me. We like this kind of stuff. We want blood calcium to be even. However, what if it becomes out of balance? What if I have too much blood calcium in the blood? We're talking about blood, not in the bones, in blood. We purposely need to keep a certain amount of calcium in the blood so whenever our tissues need it, they can grab it. But if blood calcium is too high, that can cause another whole host of problems. So if blood calcium is too high, we're going to release calcitonin, which stimulates osteoblasts. Now here's the kicker. How can osteoblasts help to lower blood calcium? Well, osteoblasts build bone. In order to build bone, they've got to pull calcium out of the blood. So if we have a problem where our blood calcium is too high, we actually want the osteoblasts. If I have too much blood calcium, we want the osteoblasts to take calcium out of the blood and help it build bone in the bone, thus lowering blood calcium back to normal. You can get it. You can also just memorize it. If you memorize one, you're going to know the other, because we're going to see another hormone that is released when blood calcium is too low. There are some thyroid gland disorders. If you've ever seen a goiter, I'm not going to ask you about this, but a goiter is when we have a very enlarged thyroid gland. It typically has to do with a deficiency of iodine, and there's lower thyroid hormone. And what happens is when there's less available thyroid hormone, it's like the thyroid gland tries to work extra hard to make up for it, and it gets big. That's the actual enlarged thyroid. As I just mentioned, one of the things that we need for the thyroid gland to produce its hormones is iodine. It's found naturally in some foods, but a lot of us get it from the iodized sea salt. On the back of the thyroid, it's kind of cute, is a collection of 4 small hormones called the parathyroid. 1, 2, 3. So we're on the back side of the thyroid. 4 little dots of hormones, of glands, collectively called the parathyroid. So it's on the posterior thyroid gland. It secretes parathyroid hormone, which is secreted when blood calcium is low. When blood calcium is low, we want to stimulate osteoclasts. Clasts break down. It's the opposite of the calcitonin. If you just memorize one, you automatically know the other. So now we're on the other side of this. What if my blood calcium is too low? If blood calcium is too low, I want to release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone will stimulate osteoclasts. By breaking down bone, calcium is released into the blood, thereby increasing blood calcium back to normal. Just memorize one, you'll automatically know the other. All right, I want to keep going a little bit so I can get through this last part more quickly. The thymus is a little bit lower. It's right above the heart. It secretes thymosins. It sounds like the name, thymosins. These develop and activate our T cell. Remember our lymphocytes? We had B as in boy, B cells, and T cells. Well, T cells go to the thymus to be matured or developed, and this is also where the regulation of T cells happens. Development and regulation, development and activation of T cells. This is a gland that as we get older, it shrinks. By the time we die, you're not going to have much of a thymus gland left at all. And that's because when we're kids, that's when we build our immune system. After we're done building our immune system, these immune cells last for a really long time, And that's why the thymus gets smaller. All right, now we're going all the way down to the adrenal glands. These are on top of the kidney. We're going to break these down into the body's response to stress. Before we do that, the adrenal glands have two parts, an outer region, inner region, kind of like the renal cortex, renal medulla. Well, guess what? The adrenal gland also has adrenal medulla, adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla is the inner region, and it secretes epinephrine, norepinephrine. The adrenal cortex is the outer region, and it releases aldosterone and cortisol. Response to stress. The adrenal medulla works together to help our body in the short-term response to stress. It makes us more alert, increases heart rate, increases blood flow to skeletal muscles, gives us more fuel. This is our fight or flight. When we're exercising, isn't exercise a stress? It's a good stress, but it's still a stress. We actually want these short-term response to stress hormones. It's going to pump more blood to our heart and our muscles. As an aside, you don't have to know this, but if you ever wanted to know, of the two, epi and norepi, we have much more of epinephrine. That's what this 85% is. You don't have to know that. But just FYI, of the two, we've got much more epinephrine. The adrenal cortex is the outer region, and we can frame this as helping our body handle long-term stress. Here's where we have cortisol. Cortisol is our natural anti-inflammatory. We want this when we're experiencing long-term stress. You've heard of a cortisone injection. That's a synthetic version of this hormone. This is our body's natural anti-inflammatory. And then we know aldosterone. Aldosterone is our salt-retaining hormone. You might be thinking, how can this deal with long-term response to stress? Because think about hydration and fluid balance, also blood pressure regulation. Sometimes we want to retain more salt. If we retain more salt, we're also going to retain more water. Water follows salt. So we can retain more water, maintain our fluid balance, maintain our hydration. If I skip it, you don't need to know it. The pancreas, in addition to working in the digestive system, it's also a gland. It is our example of an exocrine gland because it releases its hormones into a duct, and that duct will later lead to the bloodstream. The two hormones are, of course, insulin and glucagon, and these are involved in blood sugar regulation. Insulin is released when blood sugar is too high. It's produced in the pancreas, but its action is at the liver. Yes, it can also have actions elsewhere in the body, but a primary place where this goes is the liver. If our blood sugar is too high, we want the liver to take glucose out of the blood and store it as glycogen for later use. The opposite is glucagon. This is released when blood sugar is too low. This will go back into those glycogen stores and release them back into blood glucose. You can read about types of diabetes. For me, you don't need to know it. I'm more interested in talking about putting this together in terms of sports, which we're almost to. The last glands we're going to discuss would be the gonads, and they are our sex organs. In women, the sex organ is the ovary. It's also a gland. In males, the sex organs are the testes, also a gland. What do they do? Well, in women, what do the ovaries do? Of course, they're going to produce and develop the egg, but hormonally, this is where we produce our sex hormones. Estrogen and progesterone in women, testosterone, the testes produce testosterone in men. Do women have some testosterone? Yes. Do men have some estrogen? Yes. But it's quite a disparity. Estrogen. What is the function of estrogen? Stimulates growth of the egg. What is the function of progesterone? It's going to thicken the uterine wall at a certain time of the month in preparation for a fertilized egg. just in case that egg is fertilized and we need a place to implant the fertilized egg to grow as the fetus. This is extra. I'm going to talk more about it in the reproductive chapter. I'm still learning, and I just want to share this with you. We're still learning. I've been doing all these advanced courses, and we didn't know about these sex hormones until the beginning of the 21st century, the early 1900s. We didn't learn about estrogen receptors until after I graduated high school in the late 90s. So we're still learning so much. These are all functions of estrogen. You don't need to know these, but it does more than just stimulate growth of the egg and produce female secondary sex characteristics. In women, it's going to be our primary muscle builder. Keeps our bones strong. Metabolic regulation helps us with glucose regulation. You don't need to know these, but I'm just pointing out all that we're learning. Testosterone stimulates growth of the sperm in males. We know that. Okay. Here's what I want to end this chapter with. I think a more useful way for you. You're not going to be dealing as much with blood sugar regulation in an overweight, middle-aged person with cardiovascular disease. That's less likely. What's more likely is that you want to build muscle. You want to get bigger, faster, stronger. Well, hormones play a big role. And we can divide them, the ones that we need for exercise, into catabolic. Remember, catabolic is breakdown. When we exercise, don't we want to break down muscles a little bit? That's the stress we want. And then anabolic, after we exercise, when we're resting, we want to have those anabolic reactions to build back what was damaged and build it back stronger. This is an important part of exercise. Remember, exercise is a purposeful stress. What's the goal? You're purposely stressing the body to induce certain changes. You want to increase muscle mass, decrease fat mass. You want to increase your ability to perform at a certain sport or task. We must have both. You must have the stress to the body, and we must have rest. If we only have the stress, we're only going to be in the catabolic state, and we're never going to be able to build. So we have to have both. When you have both, we will induce the changes that we desire, and that includes hormonal. In order to do protein synthesis, we rely, among other things, on hormone signalers. So it's a balance. While we're exercising, we're purposely breaking down. I'm not going to ask you to memorize every single hormone, but I want you to understand these two basic states. When we're exercising, we're in a more catabolic state, which is more breakdown. That's because we're purposely putting some stress. So we're going to release catabolic hormones to handle that stress. When we are resting afterwards, and not even sleeping, but even when you go home and you rest and you fuel with good food, you're in an anabolic. This is where we build. This is more active during periods of rest to grow things back. We have to balance these. We can't be in too much of one or the other. In fact, we've already talked about most of these hormones. The catabolic, these would be our hormones in response to stress. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are our hormones for our short-term response to stress. Cortisol and aldosterone is our long-term response to stress. People think cortisol is bad. We need it when we need it. We don't want to have it prolonged release, but you want that natural anti-inflammatory at the end of exercise and for a little bit after. Then we want to switch to an anabolic state where we grow. Insulin helps us give energy to the muscles to grow. Estrogen in women helps the muscles grow. But you have to rest to get that to happen. You don't need to know this. I just want you to see the hormonal fluctuations we would expect to see during immediately after and long-term after an exercise session. At the immediate onset, we want more of those short-term hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine. We're going to have a little testosterone, that's red. We're going to have a little growth hormone, that's blue. As exercise increases in duration, we're going to have more cortisol. That's the blue. Or where's cortisol? Black. Yeah, sorry. Let me go back. As we exercise for longer, look what happens to cortisol. It begins to go up. We expect that. At the end of exercise, we expect to see a rapid spike in cortisol. But then we want cortisol to go down. And when cortisol goes down, that's when our good friend testosterone, or estrogen in women, goes up. You don't need to know this. I'm just showing you. You don't need to know this either. There's something called the testosterone-cortisol ratio. It's exactly what I was talking about. Right at the end of exercise, we have a little bit of both. Right after exercise, for a couple hours, depending on what you did, we're going to see a steep increase in cortisol. But then we want cortisol to go down. So we like cortisol, just not prolonged cortisol. And that's why we need rest. That's why we need fuel. If you don't fuel, your cortisol is going to continue to be released because it's still in a short-term fight or flight. I don't have enough fuel. By fueling properly and resting, then that allows us, as cortisol goes down, testosterone goes up. You want that ratio. You don't need to know that. Just the basic states. Catabolic while we're exercising, anabolic during rest. I give you some more information about estrogen. You don't need to know this. Estrogen is the primary driver of building muscle in women, but you don't need to know that. Estrogen fluctuates, we know that. In this chart, estrogen is the green. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up again, it goes down again, spikes all the time. Progesterone can also help with exercise, but you don't need to know this. Look at what happens to women leading up to menopause. 5 years, folks, of complete craziness. After we hit menopause, the point at which a woman has not had her period for 1 full year, estrogen shits the bed. Estrogen just craps out. And in response to that, when the body no longer has estrogen, it's going to perk up these. Because it's like, there's no estrogen, I'm going to make more of these, trying to make up for it. You don't need to know this. Just giving you some information. This transition, plus or minus menopause, can be as much as 10 years. Gentlemen, please be nice to your female friends and family. Because what's the relative hormonal change for men? What's the monthly one for women? What's happening for 5 years before menopause in women? Then it goes. So, there's serious hormonal changes happening that impact women. Yes, in men, testosterone goes down a little, but maybe it looks like that. Nothing in comparison to women, nothing like the same. All right, you don't need to know the end of this, folks. It's possible to also group these hormones into 3 phases of stress and adaptation, but you don't need to know those. All right, folks, we're going to do one more chapter on reproductive and we'll be done.